Okay, so good morning. Thanks very much for attending this session. Hopefully you'll find it enlightening as we go through the slides. My name is Mark Morley, so I'm a Product Marketing Director at Opentext. And in case you hadn't heard of Opentext, they acquired a business called GXS about 4 years ago, Global Exchange Services. And we basically provide B2B EDI services to connect supply chains around the world. Now, over the years, Opentext has acquired, I believe, about 57 different companies, so it's certainly a serial acquirer. And I'll explain more about how the different technologies of Opentext fit into this particular scenario around IoT. Okay? So, as we know, over the last 50 years in particular, it's actually 50 years this year that the first EDI message, electronic data interchange message, was sent across the supply chain. That's quite surprising when you think 50 years for an EDI transaction. And here we are today talking about IoT in relation to the same kind of technology. So it's quite a step change in terms of where the technology is going. And at the very end of this presentation, I'll be introducing blockchain as well. So where does blockchain fit into IoT, supply chain? And I think you'll find that quite interesting as we get to those slides towards the end. But if you look at the early days of B2B integration and electronic data interchange, starting in the 1970s, late 1960s, with the introduction of these two key formats that were adopted by the likes of Boeing, Chrysler, Ford, all the big companies around the world. Now, clearly, those systems have been running on mainframe systems at the time. Obviously, the concept of the cloud didn't exist back then. But over the years, we've had industry bodies that were formed to help get that technology out into the companies, developing standards, for example. And then in the 1990s, who remembers Netscape? Developing intranets and being able to share information. So that concept of collaboration, not just within the four walls of the business, but also across the supply chain, was starting to take hold. Then in the 2000s, we had the introduction of the market exchanges, so industry-specific exchanges for automotive, for high-tech, for retail. And Opentext actually acquired one of these companies, Covacint, last year, about July timeframe. And I'll come on to more about that in just one second. And then finally, in 2010, everyone was talking about cloud, mobile, big data as the key pieces of technology that companies should be investing in. And I've got some research that I'll share with you in a second that many companies, actually the analyst firms, regard clouds now almost as a commodity. Whereas back in 2010, companies were worried about security. Now it's not such an issue. Everyone takes it for granted that there are cloud-based applications that everyone can use. So I'll explain more about how this all fits together a bit later, but you can see on this slide where I've introduced blockchain, I've introduced IoT. And I'll sort of talk about the history of where IoT has come from because it's not as new as some people would, relate to. But the key thing here is that this technology around EDI and B2B integration has evolved over those 50 years. And now we're in another, the fifth generation now of new technology that needs to be leveraged across the supply chain. And I'll explain how that will happen in just one second. So I think you'll agree, there's almost this perfect storm of technology today where you've got IoT, you've got blockchain, you need the digital supply chain to provide that foundation across your business and across the extended supply chain. And of course, you've got artificial intelligence, machine learning. Now, individually, those pieces of technology are great for companies, but when you bring them together and leverage the benefits that each of those pieces of technology brings to you, you actually get some really interesting output, which I'll go through the presentation a bit later. But one of the concepts I wanted to introduce right at the beginning was this concept of the autonomous supply chain. So the ability for a supply chain to potentially be self-governing using machine learning capabilities, and I'll explain where Opentext fits into that in a second. Being able to use blockchain to improve traceability of goods as they move across the end-to-end supply chain. IoT from a connected asset point of view, so you know exactly where everything is across the supply chain. And then finally, as I said, if you want to undertake a digital transformation project, you need that digital supply chain in first to be able to leverage these other technologies. So there is a logic to why I've sort of shown this on this particular slide. But just focusing on one piece of technology there, the IoT, or Internet of Things. So a few statistics in terms, if you go to any analyst website, every analyst, whether it's Gartner, IDC, Forrester, they've all got their own views on how many connected devices there's going to be in the future. So 20 billion. By 2020. 20 countries generate 82% of the IoT revenue moving forwards, and 1 trillion sort of the global worth of IoT technology by 2025. So that's just a really brief introduction, but this one's even more interesting, especially when you look at ASPAC, where the expected growth in IoT technology is going to just explode, even more so than the other key regions there that you see on the screen. And this was taken actually from IDC's latest report around IoT spending. Interestingly, IDC have also just produced a report around blockchain spending between now and 2025. And looking at the growth curve there, even though the technology is just in its infancy today, where it's going to be in the future is quite surprising from a technology standpoint. And I'll explain more about that a bit later. Just a couple of other insights. One of the areas that I've been looking at is developing the go-to-market strategy for Opentext around IoT, specifically in the area of connected supply chain. So I've got some use cases that I'll go through later, but I just thought I'd share these ones from Boston Consulting Group on the left-hand side in terms of the key areas where IoT is expected to be used. So predictive maintenance, clearly a #1 benefit for connected devices, being able to determine when a serviceable piece of equipment is likely to fail, and being able to replace that part before it does fail. Automated inventory management, and track and trace. So I've got 3 groups of IoT use cases that I'm going to be sharing with you. One that I term pervasive visibility, one around proactive replenishment, and the other one, the final one, is predictive maintenance. So I call those the 3 Ps in terms of use cases, the high-level use cases from a supply chain perspective. Now, when you look at this heat map from Forrester in terms of which industries are going to be using, I guess, IoT in different ways for different line of business functions within different companies, you know, it's quite surprising in terms of the number of use cases, and I would expect maybe this time next year to see one of these for blockchain. So the technology is just moving so quickly, it's quite surprising, and keeping up with it is quite a challenge. But hopefully this presentation will give some insights. I wanted to pull this slide up. This is a latest slide from IDC. Now, they have been putting out a lot of thought leadership and messaging around IoT, especially in relation to what they call their third platform. Now their third platform is being expanded by machine learning, and also they're starting to introduce blockchain into the conversation as well. And as I said a moment ago, combining these technologies together from a supply chain perspective can produce some really interesting results, as you'll see a bit later on. Now, last year, and you can actually get a copy of this study from our stand, we did a study with IDC. I guess no surprise there that IDC is one of my favorite analyst firms to actually work with. But we wanted to do a study to find out if companies are actually undertaking digital transformation projects, and they wanted to explore IoT, cloud, machine learning, whatever that technology is. What do they do in terms of restructuring their supply chain? Do they have the internal resources to be able to explore all these new, great, sexy technologies? But what happens to their core ERP platform, their B2B platform? Who's managing that activities? And we found a key statistic here that CIOs would consider outsourcing their B2B integration if it meant that they could divert their internal IT resources onto these new technologies. And every company I've been speaking with in the last 6 months, they have got special interest groups internally looking at use cases, just use cases for blockchain. They've got companies exploring different ways in which IoT can be used. And as I said, IoT is not a new technology. It's just really emerged over the last 3 or 4 years with some clever marketing by some of the industrial manufacturers. I'll explain more about that in just 1 second. So this particular study was interesting because we went cross-region and also cross-industry, and I'm more than happy to get a copy of this study if you come down to our stand afterwards. So I've got some key findings from the study. You can see on the left-hand side some of the technologies that we looked at. And this first slide and the next slide look at where we are today with the technology and where we're going to be in 3 years' time. So B2B cloud networks, for example, around 75% of respondents said that they were using the cloud today. So that sort of re-emphasizes the point that cloud-based technologies have almost become commoditized. There's no worry in terms of where that information is going to be or how it's going to be managed. But of course, with Brexit, with GDPR, that could certainly change things from a data sovereignty point of view, and that's a whole different other conversation. But when you move down here, where you've got robotics, you've got IoT, you've got wearable devices, 3D printing, and even machine learning, the fastest growing piece of technology, if I just move across to the next slide, if you look at the bottom, is actually machine learning. So how can they apply advanced analytics to processes within their business to support, you know, the growth of their overall digital transformation strategy? So that was a really interesting finding from this particular study. But then looking more specifically at the IoT functions. So please indicate whether or not you're actually accomplished or realized benefits for each of your goals related to digital transformation. So most companies that are undertaking IoT projects at the moment had seen or noticed an improvement in their service performance because they're able to service their customers a lot better by responding to parts that may be failing. They can replace them fairly quickly. Better product quality, increased visibility. But then, I guess the benefit of doing this kind of study going cross-region. So what are the industry comparisons? whether you've actually accomplished those. So in automotive, improving the productivity, so 49% of respondents. In general manufacturing, improving product quality. In high tech, improving service performance, product quality for CPG, consumer product goods, and then in retail, improving service performance. So it's interesting just comparing by different industries, the different ways in which IoT is bringing benefits to their business and also to their supply chain. And to be honest, I think when you think about these different industry sectors, this is almost what I would expect in terms of advancement of technology within those respective subsectors. We then worked separately to look at by country. So if you were to look at France, for example, what was their key focus? Well, they wanted to focus, and we've actually ranked it first, second, and third. So many French respondents wanted increased agility. That was their number one priority. Whereas if you look at the UK, it was around increasing visibility across the supply chain, more connected supply chain assets. They got that increased visibility. And then in Japan, I guess no surprises there, they wanted improved productivity. So even when you know roughly what's going on in each of these countries, and you see these kind of results, it sort of helps cement, the findings that we actually got from this particular study. Benefits, certainly inventory management, knowing where your inventory is, what the levels are within the various warehouses, even on the shop floor, where you may have sensors in a part bin, for example, and being able to monitor what those levels are. Overall supply chain visibility and supply chain responsiveness. So again, I'll go through some use cases in a moment, which will hopefully put some color around these particular statistics. But I thought it's just interesting to share these for context. But then looking at the benefits by country. So in France, responsiveness, order tracking in Germany, order replenishment, inventory management, and overall supply chain visibility, which is no surprise for a Japanese company that's exporting nearly all of their goods around the world. They want to be able to track those shipments as they're moving across the global supply chains. So it's interesting getting this kind of level of detail in terms of what's going on from a supply chain point of view and how companies want to leverage IoT in that respect. So then moving on to trying to establish what some companies are defining as an IoT platform. And I'll sort of expand in terms of what I mean by that in just one second. Now, I mentioned a moment ago that IoT is not new in terms of technology. Some of the technology that underpins it's actually been around 20, 25 years. If you think of RFID technology for tracking goods, for example, that's been around for quite some time. Now, IoT as a term actually started in 1999 by a British guy, researcher called Kevin Ashton, doing work at the Auto ID Research Center in North America. So he was the one that really coined that IoT term. Now, of course, many companies and even countries were unhappy with the term IoT because it wasn't relevant to their processes. So in 2013, we had Cisco introducing the Internet of Everything. GE weren't happy with that in North America, especially from an industrial point of view, so they introduced the term around the industrial internet. German companies, they weren't happy either, so they introduced Industry 4.0. And then in Japan in 2015, they introduced the Industrial Value Chain Initiative. And finally, at the back end, China introduced Internet Plus. So these are all 6 different terms based on which industry you're in, which region you're in. I think those in Europe, many people here today based here in Europe, Industry 4.0 is probably the more popular term that people know. But in North America, GE was the one that's really put a lot of marketing around their IoT platform to promote the industrial internet. And the whole reason these companies are getting involved, even in Europe with Siemens, with ABB, they've all set up their internal software divisions because they realize that when they sell their products to their customers, they can actually make more money from the in-service support of that product through its entire life cycle. So GE, when they're selling wind turbines or jet engines, being able to predict when parts are going to fail, for example. It's all about improving the customer experience and the customer service. But from an IoT perspective, there are 3 key challenges. I've heard horror stories, or actually horror stories in the last couple of weeks around people hacking into, for all argument's sake, a coffee machine, a wireless coffee machine that's on a corporate network, people hacking into the coffee machine, getting onto the corporate network, and getting into the enterprise systems. So how do you actually secure those endpoints? That's a key challenge from a security point of view. And I've got a slide which I can share with you a bit later on how Opentext can certainly help with that piece of that particular challenge. And then standards. With all these different terms, we can't even standardize on a name for what we're talking about here. We've got 6 different terms here just for IoT. So there are moves in place, especially in North America with the US government, to try and develop alliances and standards bodies for how we not only exchange information across an IoT platform, but what are the document formats? What's the sensor information? What's the communication protocols being used? So all of that is still being worked out. And then finally, the infrastructure. If you want to monitor your shipment around the world, who's actually going to pay for that infrastructure, potentially? We all know that the US Army's got the most complex supply chain and logistics network around the world, obviously funded by the US government in terms of being able to track every single asset as it moves around the world, but car manufacturer can't do that. Once that car gets outside the four walls of the plant, how are you going to track it? Unless it's got GPS tracking and it's going to be delivered to the Middle East, for example, in a shipping container or however. You've got those kind of challenges that companies need to address. But essentially, all of those terms I just showed you really relate to this, and this is just a really high-level definition. So any machine or device connected via fixed wire or wireless, being connected to the internet, being able to transmit information. And this is the term that I've been using and sharing in various presentations over the last 6 to 12 months, and it seems to resonate as a really high-level term. I think now many people refer to IoT more on a consumer side. So if you've got a Nest thermostat at home, for example, being able to adjust the temperature, remotely through your phone. But I think for today, for the purpose of this presentation, I'm just going to refer to it as IoT. I'm not going to go through those 6 other terms as part of this presentation. Now, you may be wondering, well, why is Opentext standing up here talking about IoT? What do we know about IoT? Well, we actually acquired a company called Covacent last July. They started out as an automotive market exchange back in 2000, funded by GM, Ford, and Chrysler to help them connect to their supply chains around the world. And over the last 5 years in particular, they've transitioned their business and diversified into 2 key areas. The first one is to provide an IoT platform. So we now have an IoT platform, and the rest of the technology, which I'll introduce you to in a moment from Opentext, and how that sits above that. The other key piece is this, being able to manage user identities. So what I mentioned a moment ago about being able to hack into a coffee machine, we now have some technology that can actually secure those endpoints using identity access management solutions. And what I mean by that is that it provides one single sign-on, federated access to get access to your enterprise systems, whatever they may be. Now, for context, 25 million user identities, 15 million of those user identities are actually related to GM OnStar in North America. So if you've used a hire car in North America, it's a GM car, you've got an OnStar button for help and services. That OnStar platform is actually connected directly to our Covacent platform, and we're managing the user identities for GM worldwide for that OnStar platform. So that's just one example, and we're working with other companies as well, large companies, to manage these user identities. But the interesting thing from a supply chain point of view, everyone has thought about identity access management really from the inwards looking outwards. How do you manage the employee access? But what about the supply chain? When you've got contract manufacturers, you've got distributors, they may need to get secure access to your enterprise systems. How do they get secure access to those enterprise systems? What happens if you change a contract and switch to another distributor? How do you manage that security into your business where they may need to get access to transport management systems, warehouse management systems, and ERP platforms? So using identity access management here, you've got this outside-in view now from a supply chain management point of view, which is a really interesting concept. So from a Covacent perspective, there's two pieces. The one I just mentioned on the previous slide around being able to manage the identities of any user within the business or across the external supply chain. The other piece, the other component, is being able to apply the identity management principle to the connected device itself. So being able to almost put a halo or secure that endpoint, whatever that may be. And that's a key challenge that many companies face today. How do you secure IoT or IoT devices? So leveraging this identity management solution and the broader IoT platform that we have, we can actually bring that security now to those connected devices. Now, interestingly, when I first got interested in IoT, I attended a Cisco conference in 2013. It's their first IoT World Forum conference. One of the concepts they came up with then was that every connected device in the future would have its own profile, a bit like Facebook. It would have its own avatar. So I just mocked this up after that conference. This was back in 2013, before I knew we would be acquiring Covacent. But what about if there was something similar to a Facebook of things? And here you've got a Caterpillar device. You've got internal machines, connected devices, 252 within that particular Caterpillar device. That's part of a family of other nearly 1,500 external machines. And even here, using automated messaging from that connected device, the engine, connected device within that Caterpillar machine, the air filter's blocked, replaced immediately, and as you would do within Facebook, here we're actually linking in with the supplier directly. So it's conceptual, visionary, just to sort of explain potentially how you may collaborate with suppliers in the future. And of course, in the Facebook world, that would be your friends. But here, it's actually a supplier. So it's just conceptual. It's just really to get discussions going in terms of where things could go in the future. But I thought it was really interesting from an identity management point of view, where we could be going in the future. So about 18 months ago, I had a workshop with Gartner. And it was really interesting when they came into our office, because they sort of highlighted these core capabilities for an IoT platform. You need to be able to connect to the device, number one. You need to be able to archive and manage the billions of pieces of information coming off those sensors. Where do you actually archive that so everyone can analyze it? You need the analytics platform to mine that information and get valuable insights into what's going on across the business. You may need to send that information into a back-end ERP platform or a transport management system. So how do you integrate to those back-office systems? And what I've just been talking about, security. Now, when I underlaid or underpinned everything that Opentext offers, from the Covasint technology for security, from content services, and what I refer to there are content services, you may have heard of a company called Documentum that was used to be owned by EMC. So we acquired Documentum as part of our content services group last year. So the ability to be able to archive that sensor information in a content management platform. And from our argument's sake, Documentum is like an enterprise-grade version of SharePoint. If you're using SharePoint within your business to archive information. Analytics, we acquired an analytics company on the US West Coast, and we now actually have a direct competitor to IBM Watson. So we have something called Opentext Magellan, which I'll introduce you to in a second. The key difference is that our platform, our machine learning platform, is actually open source. So if you develop any algorithms on this Magellan platform, you own the IP of it. If you develop any algorithms on IBM Watson, they own the IP. So because it's all developed on open source technology, you've got the ability to configure that machine learning platform to suit your business. And I'll explain how machine learning fits into IoT in just one second. And then the business division that I work for, Business Network, so this is really the supply chain, the integration of the supply chain, undertaking the integration to SAP and other enterprise platforms, providing that supply chain connectivity piece. Just see how I'm doing on time. So when we leverage that technology, we talk about establishing a supply chain platform. When you think of the different types of information flowing across the end-to-end supply chain and into your enterprise, you've got structured and unstructured information. Structured information could be an EDI document. Unstructured information could simply be a PDF. Okay, so you've got dumb documents and intelligent documents that are moving across the supply chain. So you've got all of this information potentially moving into your business or coming into your business. B2B transactions, you've got trading partner information. You may even have social media listening devices out there around what your suppliers think of you or what consumers think of you. But also we have the ability to take in news feeds. So if there is an earthquake somewhere in the world, we've got some technology that allows you to monitor news feeds. And if it's relevant to your day-to-day business, we can actually put up a red flag to say your supply chain is going to be impacted in a particular location. And all the suppliers within a 20-mile radius are going to be impacted as well. And I'll come on to that in just one second. But then we've got regulatory data and, of course, sensor data. So all of that information, theoretically, should be going into some form of central repository, supply chain data lake. And then what you have sitting on top of that, I guess you could describe this as an oil rig. You're mining that information for useful insights around the business, and different users within the business, from procurement, manufacturing, logistics, and customers, will need to use it. So you may need to use that information for that term I introduced earlier on around improving visibility, pervasive visibility. You may need to automate a replenishment process for whatever reason if you're undertaking vendor-managed inventory. And then predictive maintenance. So they're really the the low-hanging fruit that Gartner specify that companies should be thinking about from a supply chain perspective when looking at IoT use cases and IoT type of technology. And these are the three here, just very briefly. So pervasive visibility, proactive replenishment, and predictive maintenance. And I'm going to show 2 use cases now for these 2 on the left-hand side. So if you think of a manufacturing company, they may have material storage racks or parts bins on the shop floor on the left-hand side. So you'll have sensors on those material storage racks, actually monitoring the consumption of that material as it gets used in the factory. You would have an analytics platform monitoring that consumption level. Now, at some point, there's going to be a trigger from the analytics platform to the procurement system to say, we've reached a certain level. We need to start reordering those goods because they're going to run out and our production line potentially could stop. And this is really where the business network comes in that we have, and we actually call this Trading Grid. So Trading Grid is really our procurement platform, provides us a portal to connect with all suppliers around the world. So then connecting into the supplier, who can then deliver this from the supplier location, GPS tracked, so using the IoT platform to track the shipment as it moves through the supply chain from one location to another. And when I introduced this slide to Gartner, one of the terms that I've got in the top right now is something called device managed inventory. So if you're a retailer, if you're a small supplier in the high-tech space in particular, vendor managed inventory is a well-known term within supply chain. I said that in the future, with many connected devices, there could be an opportunity to rethink this, maybe call it device managed inventory from an IoT perspective. So there's a lot of interest in terms of that particular concept. So this is sort of what I would call the proactive replenishment, where we're using analytics to monitor the replenishment process, the stock levels within the factory or on the shop floor, and using the analytics to trigger the procurement process. So then taking that one step further, train manufacturer, a train operator. So this is now the preventive maintenance or predictive maintenance scenario. So we're working with a company called Knorr-Bremse. So Knorr-Bremse provide the braking systems to trains, trucks, whatever that braking system requirement is. We have embedded our analytics software into the software of the braking system. So that analytics routine on the train is actually monitoring the performance of the brakes. Is it likely to fail? Is there some complication with that environment? Now, by connecting and sending the sensor information from the train to our IoT platform, using the telematics capabilities that we have as well, the maintenance facility needs to make a decision, do we repair or replace the part that's about to fail on that train? So by going up to this platform that we have called Magellan, and what I said about Magellan was that it can actually take in information from different sources. So being able to look at peak travel analysis. So what's the load on that particular train, number of passengers? Did that have an influence on whether that part or component failed? What are the rolling stock running hours? What's the historical brake failure rates and the maintenance schedules? So being able to ingest all of this information in addition to the sensor information from the train into Magellan and allowing Magellan's machine learning capability to determine should we repair or replace that part. Now, if we repair it, this train company is likely to be using outside contractors. Those outside contractors may need to get access to digital information around disassembly videos, drawings, CAD models associated with that train. How do they get secure access to it? Using identity management. And if they wanted to 3D print or download a drawing or whatever to a ruggedized mobile device, they could then do so. But the identity access management is providing that external security of your digital information to allow that field service engineer to get access to that information. But if they can't repair it, well, simply we replace it and we contact the supplier. Again, the maintenance engineer going through the secure portal and being able to deliver that spare part to the maintenance facility. So I know it's a complex slide, and I deliberately built it up to try and tell a story, really for how the Opentext technology can help underpin this IoT platform. So on this center, we've got Covacent, the IoT platform. So this is providing the connectivity to the devices. Content management for all digital assets associated with the design of that train and the maintenance of that train. We have Magellan Analytics at the top, and then our business network to actually undertake the procurement process. So when you pull all of this together, it does provide quite a compelling story, if you like, of how IoT can help initiate the procurement process, but also introducing machine learning to decide, should we repair or replace? Now, if you replace that train in the center with a car, a water pumping station, a plane, whatever that serviceable piece of equipment is, the story around the outside remains more or less the same. So finally, in the last few minutes, blockchain. So this is certainly interesting, and what I wanted to try and do here is introduce this in the context of IoT. So consider this the blockchain of things. And I haven't even introduced machine learning into this as well yet, but I'm just going to take blockchain and IoT for this last piece. So blockchain as a technology really started in the financial services sector, used as a way to transport bitcoins for banking and financial institutions. However, that actual transport capability, moving transaction information, that's a really piece of interesting technology, the blockchain component of that. And in the last 6 months, it's really where blockchain in the supply chain as a concept has started to appear. And even Gartner, I think last July, had it on one of their technology hype curves. Blockchain in the supply chain was on the emerging piece of their hype curve. So when you look at all the noise that's been made out there in the market today, there's one common trend around where a lot of the blockchain stories are coming from, and it's around supply chain traceability. So there's been stories, for example, with Walmart in North America procuring their meat suppliers from China, but they want to know, even down to the animal, in which field, in which farm, in which part of China has that meat or the goods, dairy products, for example, been sourced from. And actually, how do you actually track those goods as it moves across the supply chain to the Walmart stores in North America? So that brings a whole new element. And where do you actually store that information? So by combining the information from the B2B transactions, the shipping information, the advanced ship notices, the purchase orders, being able to extract that information from the EDI documents and write that information to a blockchain, in addition to the sensor information around the delivery of the goods across the supply chain, that's really where things get interesting. And that's really where we're at today. And it's interesting because I've been around many company meetings over the last 6 to 12 months even, and I deliberately asked the question, provoking the question, are you looking at blockchain? Many companies are at the stage of just looking at use cases. They haven't actually implemented a solution. They're looking at use cases, and it's just surprising the number of different use cases. But I just wanted to put these ones up at the bottom here. So tracking high-value goods such as diamonds, conflict minerals is a use case that I'll go through in a second. Pharma and life sciences. Supply chain finance. You know, supply chain finance as a concept has been around for many years, but people are starting to talk about blockchain potentially reinventing that whole process. And for that reason, we've actually partnered with a blockchain company in London called BlockX. So they have their own, what they call a digital asset exchange platform, and we're going to be integrating their platform to ours. And consider this as blockchain as a service. So if you have information that you want to apply to a blockchain, you would connect into our business network, and then we would send that information, whatever that information is, to their blockchain platform, and that would get written to the block. And I know this may sound a bit complicated at the moment, but I'll explain in more detail through a use case in just one second. But essentially, blockchain is utilizing this so-called distributed ledger technology. It's not a database, and I want to make that very clear, because with a normal database, you can actually go in and edit and make changes to the database. The beauty of blockchain and why so many companies are interested in it is because you can append information to the block, but you can't change it afterwards. And that's the key thing from a traceability standpoint. So you can't falsify data. There were stories last year around Kobe Steel in Japan. They were sending steel shipments to Nissan, Mazda, Toyota, various plants around the world. And their Kobe Steel were actually falsifying that supplier data as that shipment moved across the supply chain. Now with blockchain, there's no way that you can falsify that data, which is quite interesting from a traceability standpoint. So yeah, so we formed this, I guess you could call it an arm's length partnership with BlockX, and what we're going to be doing is working with them to not only integrate our platforms. They are primarily in the financial services sector at the moment, but they have said because of the transaction-based nature of our business network and the growth in supply chain and the interest in blockchain here, that supply chain is their next sector they're going to be working towards. So we're going to be partnering with them in this particular area. So it brings another, I guess, string to the bow of the IoT kind of scenario. And I just wanted to sort of bring that to life. You may have heard of this particular scenario, and I wanted to sort of explain how we would fit into that. So with Trading Grid in the center, this is our procurement platform where you can actually place your orders, your purchase orders, your invoices. Covasint is represented by the Purple Clouds, the IoT platform that we acquired last year, and BlockX, again, integrated through an API to our Trading Grid. So BlockX is the blockchain partner. Now, what I've done here is sort of map out from North America where you've got this connected shipment. The pallet will have a sensor on it. The goods will have temperature sensors on it. And as those goods move across the supply chain, you've got certain pieces of information taken from the B2B or the EDI transaction that's written to the blockchain in the top there. So in that top right, you've got, for example, the supplier ID number, which you can grab straight away from the EDI document. You've got the shipment number. You've got the carrier ID number. So if you're moving multimodal across different 3PL carriers, whether it's DHL, FedEx, different providers, you know exactly at which point in the supply chain that shipment is moving on which multimodal provider. And then finally, just to confuse things here, we've actually got a temperature reading. So every hour that shipment moves across the supply chain from North America to Brazil, we're monitoring the temperature of that shipment. And that information is being written to the blockchain. So we're leveraging a combination of B2B transaction information, sensor information from the shipment, and it could be any type of sensor information. It could be a G-force sensor if that is really expensive China and it drops, gets delivered to its final destination in pieces. That's the last thing you want. So the in-country 3PL, you can see here, the temperature's actually gone up to 9 degrees, and that's a warning to say potentially these perishable goods have been damaged in transit. Now, even before these goods get to the retailer, because the retailer is also connected into this environment as well, they know they've got an inbound shipment where the perishable goods are likely to be damaged, and so they can reorder those goods with the supplier. The other thing is that because we've got a blockchain actually monitoring this whole shipment process, the retailer could actually use the evidence in the blockchain relating to this particular shipment to renegotiate the supply and distribution contracts, maybe with the supplier, or more importantly, with a 3PL carrier. And oh, by the way, this particular truck, we know the chassis number of the truck as well. We've got GPS tracking on it. You've got a dodgy refrigeration unit on that because we know that our goods have been damaged. So this is almost the macro and micro level of visibility that potentially we can get now if you combine IoT with blockchain. Now, taking that one step further, and this is my last slide, I think, conflict minerals. So in North America, this is quite an important law that was introduced by Obama in 2014. And the whole point of this is to be able to trace minerals, the so-called 3TG minerals, across the supply chain. And essentially, these 3TG minerals, the most popular destination or location for mining them is in the center of Africa in the Democratic Republic of Congo. So tin, tungsten, tantalum, and gold. Now, every company that reports the SEC in North America, that sort of file their annual reports to the SEC, has to demonstrate they're not using conflict minerals anywhere across their supply chain. So these minerals, now for someone like General Motors with 20, 30,000 trading partners all over the world, that's a mammoth undertaking. How do you survey your entire supply chain of 30,000 trading partners every year to make sure that you're not using conflict minerals? So when this law was introduced in 2014, there was an organization called the Conflict-Free Sourcing Initiative that developed a Microsoft Excel spreadsheet. And the idea was that GM and other companies would email this out to their suppliers. They would have to fill in a spreadsheet to confirm the source of where those minerals were mined from and to prove they weren't coming from this central part of Africa. And then collating all that information from the spreadsheets at the end of every year just to file to the SEC, that was a mammoth task. So needless to say, there were some software vendors that came out with collaboration portals where you could upload that information, but you still got the same challenge of making sure that you can engage with your entire supply chain. So from a blockchain perspective, there is a potential here to leverage blockchain for conflict minerals traceability. And in the European Union, the EU has actually approved the same ruling that North America approved back in 2014. But so far, they've not instigated it anywhere across the European Union yet because they don't know how to do it. So they've approved the ruling that companies are going to have to report on conflict minerals in Europe, but they don't know how to actually implement it. And maybe blockchain could provide an answer to that. So in a similar way to the last slide, the difference with this particular blockchain is that I'm actually monitoring the source of the minerals. So in this case, the mine, where those minerals are actually mined from, we know the ID and location of where that mine is. That's written to the blockchain. Those minerals are actually shipped via GPS-tracked truck to the port. And again, that information, the shipment location, is tracked in the blockchain. Then the ship is actually GPS tracked to the component supplier or manufacturer in the UK. They're using the gold, in this case, to manufacture electronic connectors that are fitted to a car. But again, that shipment is going through a customs depot. You're going to have a local in-country delivery van that's going to be taking the minerals, the raw minerals or whatever, to the gold connector manufacturer. And then finally, those gold connectors get delivered to North America, where they're fitted to the car. Now, of course, every car that comes off the production line is going to have a VIN number, vehicle identification number with it, and then it's sold in the dealer network. So what you've got here from left to right is complete end-to-end traceability of not only knowing in the blockchain which car has got which set of connectors in which batch of minerals from which mine, and all of that is traced through the blockchain. And also I've introduced IoT in this case for GPS tracking of that shipment. But of course, you could have the sensors on the pallets. You could have it on the containers carrying the minerals as well, depending on how, what level of traceability you want. So it is conceptual. Again, what I'm showing here is the same as what every other company is doing at the moment in terms of coming up with use cases. But for supply chain and traceability relating to conflict minerals, I think this is a perfect example. And using the blockchain to actually manage that information, and maybe using a blockchain for each subsequent shipment. And finally, the last thought on this, when I spoke with a blockchain company, could we actually overlay machine learning on top of the blockchain as well? So if you want to compare blockchain and the shipments, is there a way of looking at all that information held in the blockchain to look for even stronger insights, because you've got the IoT sensor information built into this as well. So who are we, I should say? So Opentext, $2.3 billion revenue company, focusing really on these solutions in the center. So we've acquired 57 companies over the years, and we've really split them into these key areas. So Experience Suite is all about developing website content, digital asset management. So if Ford or BMW or any company wants to launch a new product, they will need to make sure those retail locations have got, at a push of the button, all the latest videos, promo materials associated with that particular product. So we have capabilities to manage those digital assets. Business Network is really the second largest business unit within Opentext, and represents about 1/3 of the overall revenue. And again, we're providing this connectivity out to the supply chain. Process Suite, so being able to define workflows within the business and being able to align workflows according to specific business processes. We have that capability. Content Services and Discovery. So Discovery is an interesting one. We acquired a company last year called Guidance Software. So for example, if there is a police inquiry, and we actually work with a number of police forces in the UK, where they want to search, I don't know, millions of emails to look for evidence across those, this Guidance software can actually interrogate all the emails looking for specific keywords to actually narrow down to maybe 10 emails that could be of interest. So it's that discovery capability that we have using text-based searching. And this is really where Opentext started. So Opentext started at the University of Waterloo, and we actually developed the initial search engine that was bought and licensed to Yahoo. So we actually indirectly started up Yahoo's search engine business. Now, if we kept hold of that technology, and we do use it to an extent within Content Services today, we could have been the same size as Yahoo, but that's one of those decisions that was made back then. And what we're about is providing this connectivity now for people, systems, and things across the supply chain. So 22 of Gartner's top 25 supply chains connected into our business network. 8 trillion in transaction value, 24 billion transactions moving across our network on an annual basis. So you can imagine applying analytics to this business network, which is what we've done, the deep insights that supply chain leaders and procurement functions can actually obtain based on that information flowing across the business. And with that, I know I've thrown a lot of slides at you, but hopefully you found it interesting, sort of expand the conversation around IoT, what it is, what it isn't, and even where some of the newer technologies coming in with blockchain and how that sort of relates in as well.